Okay. Yeah, go on, go on.
I wouldn't say that this is the easiest question to start with, because to be honest, I'm not really sure that there is a specific definition of what ethical AI is. To me, the best way to actually look at it is rather where it comes from, what questions have been posed up until now, and where the research field in ethics actually is, and the framework, basically. And I think that's when we're speaking now about ethical AI, it's not the same as a couple of years ago, but we think usually about responsible AI, trustworthy AI, AI that's also, well, basically any topic, any of the points that we can, for example, see in specific frameworks such as the ALTAI. I think that's all those different aspects have to be taken into account when you look at ethical AI, and have different point of views and different aspects of an AI solution for, well, for it to be trustworthy and ethical.
Okay, thank you. I have a question to both of you. So during the bootcamp you just did, we've seen a bit of algorithm bias. So maybe you can talk about it.
Thank you. So yeah, during our training at Le Wagon, we had the opportunity to actually discuss the topic of bias with our machine learning teacher. And we actually saw it through the talk from Joy Boulamwini that you referred to, Jérôme. So actually, like, the software or the design didn't encompass for minorities when it was created. So the issue with AI as we have it now is that if it's not properly designed or not well thought through, it's just going to replicate and amplify the biases that we have already as a society or as in history. So this is the discussion we had with Le Wagon. Nicole, would you like to add something?
Yes, of course. So basically, I think one of the important things that we should mention is basically an ethical AI must adhere to specific guidelines. So for instance, in the coded bias that we did inside the classroom, one of the main things that we try to tackle is, from a technical perspective, what should we change? And from a non-technical perspective, how we should construct certain teams, from engineering teams or other more multidisciplinary teams that can be brought together to tackle this whole issue. Because right now what we see that is happening is more and more agencies, governmental agencies or private corporations are building their whole ecosystem around artificial intelligence. And right now we see, for instance, in US or China, they're using facial recognition software, or or in other cases, for instance, who gets parole, who doesn't. So we must really check these models thoroughly, because if we don't, having a system which predicts who gets parole and who doesn't can have a pernicious effect, which basically amplifies the same historical biases that we see reflected in our society. So during the campus, for instance, on bootcamp, we spoke about, from a technical perspective, how can we treat, how can we build these teams to tackle those issues. So for instance, we mentioned that we have like, in the modeling side, what needs to be tweaked, adding like a fairness criterion, or like having other like demographic parity and other these criteria that must be checked. And we also, I think our professor, our teacher during that week showed us some work from University of Chicago that basically you could put your model inside and it checked if it's unbiased or not. So there's work being done in that perspective.
So yeah, thank you, Nicole and Alice. So that's what we're doing here in Le Wagon in a couple hours, let's say, in one workshop. But you and Ars, are things done? I know you're from VUB. What is done there about those algorithm bias? Do you do some kind of workshop or things like that about that topic?
Yes, sure. But maybe with the risk of being with a pain in the ass, I would like to point out that ethics is about much more than the software side. And there are many effects, ethical effects, that are not being talked about, like the impact of technology and specifically AI on our thinking, the epistemological effect. Similar to if you have a map, once you have a map, you start to see everything as a map, but it's not a territory. So it changes our thinking, makes us more stupid, I think. Or the fact that knowledge is moving to machines, and so the bargaining power of people in their jobs is lowering, or the shift of control to governments because they have more control over the citizens, and these kind of things. So I just want to point out, and I don't know if I don't want to change the debate. But I think it's important to not forget that it's about much more than bias only, although it's a very important and very visible and urgent thing to tackle. But indeed, of course, we've been teaching about this for quite a while, and especially how hard it is to interpret these things, because you have, of course, biases that are reflected from society. Even analyzing whether there is really bias is difficult. You cannot make models neutral for more than two biases in principle, from mathematical perspective and so on. So it's a very complicated matter. Okay, I don't know if I start rambling, and apologies. I just want, yeah. So yes, we're working on it.
No, yes. No, okay. So right now in teams, we don't have let's say in AI practitioner teams, we don't have a role looking at that problematic ethical AI, let's say. Do you think we should have at least, or maybe not one person dedicated to it, but it should be something which needs to be as important as having like alpha role or a full role on it? Someone want to? Yeah. No. Okay.
I think that what you just pointed out is the way the industry is also slowly moving forward to that. So as we've seen in the past, guidelines have already been set up, a couple of ideas of, okay, what should robots or what should AI be doing or not. That has been translated into framework. You actually mentioned also before that we should also think about ethics by design. So really incorporate the design, the fairness or discrimination or other aspects such as Johan talked about into the design of the solution itself, to make sure that you don't develop something and then afterwards realize, okay, we have negative aspects of that with the solution. So that's really something important. And we've already also seen in the past that's putting the responsibility of making those choices only on the shoulders of a couple of developers or business owners, business developers is not enough. The best approach that also apply in other ethical contexts, such as, for example, the healthcare industry, when you've got to make a choice about whether you're going to give a specific treatment that can be quite costly or quite invasive to someone. There, it's a type of industry where answering those ethical questions, they've already developed an approach of putting together ethical boards with different stakeholders and different people, also the patients, the doctors, so that everyone that has an interest in that specific issue can actually come forward and speak about it, and so that people that have to implement those decisions afterwards know that, okay, there is a body that's going to be talking about it from different perspectives, and that will be both a reference to, okay, what can I do about it, but also taking the decisions and the responsibility and giving arguments for the decision-making process. And that's, I think, something which is really important.
So we should make the problematic a bit larger to the company and do it like from the stakeholders to the developers, and it needs to be implemented as a business requirement into the different AI products. Is what you're saying, right?
Yes, definitely. Yes, both having the people that want the AI solution, because okay, what can they do? What can they get out of that? They've got their own motivations, but also the people that need to implement it, the users afterwards, and sometimes it's not even the users, but the people that get affected. So the end customer, consumer, or customer also. So all those different people have a right to, okay, I'm actually being confronted to AI. AI is a tool that's being used with or on me. They need to be able to have a voice on the subject.
And someone want to react over that? Yeah. Yeah. Alice?
Actually it just raises also the question of accountability of AI. Who's responsible within the company? You know, if something goes wrong, and you know, I as a citizen, I want to know, like, if that at the end of the day, I'm gonna have oversight, or the institution that's just gonna look after my rights. So yeah, the question, I think, of accountability is quite important now, especially as we don't see much regulation in place. And I think with having like a lack of regulation, it can, I mean, the issue is that the bias are just gonna get like repeated, and the systemic issues are just gonna get repeated and will keep on emerging. And also to add on to something, that Nicole said, it's like, I think we need to bring in like diverse teams and hybrid teams as well, bringing on not only like technologists, but ethicists, like social scientists as well, to actually have like diverse opinion on the issue at hand.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I can't agree more. Indeed, it's interdisciplinarity, and because that's why we often talk about the AI mindset in companies, because it changes all departments. You need to monitor it from throughout the life cycle as well. So during design, but also deployment, updating the models, and so on. And then also educate the users, because if someone uses your product in the wrong way, why should you be accountable? And we make the comparison: if you buy a city car and you drive in the desert, it's not made to that purpose. So, but often in technology, we expect them to solve everything. So, but on the other hand, I think we can learn a lot from existing sectors like elevators that have quality control organisms, insurances, risk. I think we should go for a risk-based approach with audits and so on. But this diversity is crucial. I agree, and it's a balance, because you need to be. I always say you need to be creative and critical minded at the same time, because it has a lot of value, but you should be very careful. So we should be also careful not to not invest into it, because we would be losing a lot of value.
Basically, I just wanted to add that perhaps sometimes there is also a difference of interests. For instance, in the regulation that Alice meant, that sometimes when there is no regulation, that means that there is a regulation, but it's unofficial, it's incognito behind the scenes that is acting. So sometimes underlying and overemphasizing a regulation or the need for a new regulation, highlighting it, is very crucial, because all these things that you mentioned that we're dealing with, because I think we're like in the fourth revolution, it's something that really needs to be highlighted, and the dangers that it entails. And moreover, I think also that this discussion can go in many ways, like also building multidisciplinary teams, also communicating the results and what do these mean, but also accountability, as you mentioned, but also thinking in a way that is interpretable. Because if we're receiving decisions and talking about populations that can have a crucial impact on the social life, we cannot merely just talk something that we cannot interpret and give very good reasons about each decision. So it's not only about checking as you mentioned previously, this is not merely an engineering problem. This is a problem more general beyond engineering teams that we are trying to create. Yes, that's for now.
Can I add something? Because it's I completely agree, but I'm very realistic and pragmatic on the interpretability part, because the exact value of AI is that we don't understand it. Because if we can understand it, we could have done it. Okay, maybe it would be more expensive and so on. So I don't believe that it will happen. It's so because the fact that it can do things that we cannot do, like in high dimensional spaces, entanglement and complex problems at scale. So I think we should be prepared that it will not happen. I think it's the economic power or value is too big. It's like cars. In the beginning, many people died. We were shocked, but we just accepted the people dying because it brought so much value. Now it still happens, but we just accept it. We don't talk about it. Well, we still talk about it. But. So I just want to add, I think we should be realistic and not, that doesn't mean that nothing should happen on interpreting the results, but yeah, I have another positive.
And how would you educate the end user about that problematic? So let's say if we talk about the example of a car, you have an AI-based car, let's say. How would you say, do you feel it's acceptable to say, hey, let it grow. We need 10, 20 years to be better. If accident happens, that's it. How can we make that part, let's say, easier or talked about, let's say?
I don't know, but what we'll probably do is adapt society to the technology. That's what we typically do as humans. The technology stays and we change, but...
I think also about the car, there's also the accountability problem. If the car kills someone, there's not a human to blame anymore. Perhaps there's a corporation or something. So this raises new issues there, and also the legal part, who will be held accountable. But perhaps the truth is that what drives also the human nature is that sometimes we need that accountability to be directed towards a person. When no one can be held accountable, then I don't know.
How can let's say a firm of the state regulate that? How could we have like a policy, an AI policy, trying to see which fault is it? So the lawyers or the officer will go check the car and say, hey, it's the company's fault, it is the user fault. Is this something like having that kind of policy for you a good idea, bad idea, feasible or not?
If I may, I believe that in the end, the problem is not really AI related completely. I mean, it's a risk that you accept when you go into a plane. If you use a car and suddenly the brake breaks, it's also going to cause accidents and so on. So I think that the focus itself on the AI problem is just a side effect of there is something which can be used in a specific way. And if you don't use it in a good way, or we don't maintain it, it can actually cause issues. And regulating on that, well, the problem with regulation is that it always catches up with technology as technology advances. So as Johan was mentioning, there needs to be a risk-based approach, especially for AI, which is a bit similar to other industries that have been evolving on that. But to me, putting the problem of accountability on that type of problems that could occur is like saying, okay, what if we put, for example, the first months or years that microwaves arrived, and people were, oh, it's wonderful, but they did not really understood how a microwave actually worked, and started putting many things in the microwave until we realized, okay, we cannot do anything with a microwave. We need to educate people on how to use it properly, and now it's commonly accepted that we don't put metal into microwaves, we don't put living people, animals, for example, in microwaves and so on. So I think it's the time for society to adapt to, okay, there is an AI and I need to adapt to it. Likewise, a lot of self-driving cars for the moment sometimes cause accident, but mainly because also the driver completely loses control. They were initially never meant to be, okay, I can go on the passenger seat and leave it drive completely autonomously. It was not meant to be used that way. And in my opinion, it's also an opportunity which is given basically to society to give those to think about the problem, the questions that it poses, and to say, okay, now we need to think about it together and try to find a common answer. And that answer might not be fixed; it might also evolve the way cars are going to be evolving over time, for instance. But it's just that we need to think about it just.
So basically, you're saying trust AI, but I should be educated how to trust it.
Yes, trust AI like it's a tool. It's not a mature tool yet, so people don't really know how to use it. But as much as the more time advances and the more the tool becomes mature and reliable, the better it's going to be. And we can see the same stuff for a lot of different industries that have evolved over time. And just look at medicines, for instance. We used to have a lot of side effects on medicine, and the more medicine advances, the more science on that topic advances, the better, the more reliable they become. I think it's just a different tool to use in a different context, but.
Someone want to add something?
I can add something that I believe. I just feel that there's a substantial difference between the different technologies of microwave and having actually a predictive model that receives crucial social decisions that we see enforced in different countries, from governmental agencies to private corporations. Like, as I said, if you will get paroled or not, or facial recognition systems that perhaps some people would consider, let's say, a changing point, a turning point into human history, perhaps. That's why it's important to know where we're heading. At least this is my opinion. And I believe strongly that some people, that if I knew that an AI will judge me on something, and I don't know, I'm from a marginalized group, and some people would tell me that they're excited. Perhaps if that AI judges me, I wouldn't be so excited personally, because I want to know exactly. So we need to know how this model is built, but also the social implications that it has on a more general, larger scale. Because that's why I think my point of view is more on what we're calling hybrid intelligence. Humans and machines collaborate, because for some people, artificial intelligence, I know that it sounds like a buzzword, but for me, what is amazing is what can be achieved with lots of computation powers and statistics, all entailed together in multiple layers. Some people, like for instance, would consider that intelligence, but other people, like if it passes the Turing imitation game, perhaps in that sense, it is intelligence if you can't tell the difference between what it is and what it isn't, but it doesn't have intelligence in the sense that we have, or in the sense that dog has, or more biological creatures have. So I think that's a substantial difference that exists in that respect, in that regard. Do you want to answer?
Yes, I want to continue indeed, but AI, they call it a general purpose technology, and sometimes it's trying to regulate it in this way. I think it's just regulating mathematics. It's, yeah, you can kill people with smart mathematics because it makes you deliver, yeah, I don't know, information that you could otherwise not obtain. So it's quite absurd thing to do, and very interesting. Yeah? So it's also nice, I think, to see that philosophers who could not find a job 10 years ago are now the hottest profession. No, but I think indeed, and that's why we need big thinkers and not only technicians, because it's a very, we need to rethink how society works, because it reshapes our economy and how we think about the commons and so on. And a lot of costs will be absorbed by society. Like with cars, we need safe roads. We invest heavily in roads, in traffic signs, in education and so on, traffic and driver's license and so on. So I think we should also debate, see it much wider than the algorithm and so on.
Do you, like you just said about the algorithm, if we take a step back when building the, let's say, the AI, the future tool, the business tool, would you say that algorithm or AI as a better impact on the ethical problematic? Or it's both, it can be both.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
What would you say as more of an impact towards ethical AI? Would we say how we build algorithm or the source of the data?
I think the fundamental problem is a philosophical one. It's really, it's like Heidegger saw it as well, for the early days of computers, but the culmination of Aristotelian thinking. So the fact that we try to simplify the world into numbers that have no meaning, that's the core of the problem. Computer is no meaning in machines. We add numbers, we multiply them, and then we have through algorithms, we have an outcome. They manipulate data, of course, sometimes they don't. And then we feed them back to the real world, but the machine has no clue. And this is really the core of the problem. There is no ethics within the machine. It's unexisting. I'm not. I hope I'm not very. Sorry. I hope I'm not. Yeah.
I just want to add to that to me, it's also sometimes an opportunity. If you look at discrimination cases, for example, for loans at banks, if you used to only rely on bankers, it was very difficult to understand why a specific banker has taken a decision and to prove that there is discrimination when he's making a decision, when those people are making decisions. If you actually get a centralized tool that's on which, well, first you can probably try to investigate how it works, but also you can actually look at the decisions that it has made on the larger numbers and actually realize that it is discriminating, there is discrimination present, and then the first step towards detection and then mitigating there is already present. So it's not, well, it's a liability, but at the same time, it's also an opportunity to try to see, okay, we have an issue here. Now we actually identify the issue. Now we can start tackling it. Right. And I just wanted to react to your point before. I think that indeed comparing microwave with AI is not really the same, but yeah, the spectrum of AI is very, very broad. But indeed, going back to the risk approach, AI affecting humans should be really on the higher risk and should really be regulated as much as possible to make sure that there is no discrimination there. There is a difference between that and just implementing it in a Roomba for a vacuum cleaner at your home. That's not the same type of risk. So there, being a bit more flexible with that is good.
I actually have a question, like for you, Martin, which companies come to you, and is there actually a will within the corporations to change, and do they recognize that there are like bias and that they can improve their technologies, like you said?
It depends a bit on the company, it depends on the use case. There is, however, definitely recently an awareness that those issues can occur and we should actually think about it. But usually the burden or the responsibility of raising those issues is actually put on our side rather than the company side itself. Although, well, it's usually because they don't really know what to expect either. They don't really know always what type of questions they should ask or what kind of problems can occur. If you've never been confronted with, let's say, bias in data, for instance, it's quite difficult to understand where it comes from and to just detect it in the first place. So it's a two-way street basically, and we just have to work together towards identifying those problems.
Yeah, I think it's like also one of the major issue, like we raised as well as a student. It's like, how do you build awareness around you, where for some people it's just being like, you know, you say like a fish in the water, a fish doesn't know it evolves in water. You know, if you're a privileged person and the technology has been created for you, you know, you're not impacted by maybe the abusive system out of it. So how do you bring awareness like around you? And what worries me is the lack of concern around these topics, because people who are not being abused by this technology, they don't feel like it's of their concern. So I'm a bit worried. I don't know what's your experience into sharing, you know, those issues around you, and which feedback do you get?
Actually, I see a lot of concern, but it's more the awareness where it creeps and how to understanding it. It's creating a good understanding how to be vigilant, and that's very difficult. Also because it's a very abstract. It's mathematics in the end, so it's very abstract, and And if you teach about it in principle or in theory, it doesn't, yeah, it's impossible. And then you start implementing, using it, and then yeah, it comes back at you. You can have very interesting effects. So I agree, it brings a lot of value. And what I find very inspiring is how much we learn about society through this algorithm. It forces us to think about what kind of world do we want, because we cannot say anymore, okay, it's human, and we, you know, often we don't take decisions because now it's a machine, and you need to decide how you program it, what it does, and so you need to make ethical choices. I think that's one of the big problems too. We need to decide as a society what we want, and no one is ready to do that.
Yeah, also, I think we need to move away, I think, from the romantic view around AI. You know, what is AI? At the end of the day, it's like, I don't know, a compression of statistic, or, you know, for some people, I don't know, it was like a US author who said AI is like data mining on steroid. You know, at the end of the day, it's statistic, it's computer power. So yeah, I think we need to move away from the romantic and maybe the dystopian future. And like you said, start thinking about what we want as a society. But the issue I see there is that often, you know, the private interest and the public interests are just so like, there's such a huge gap. And I'm worried as well, as you shared, it's like the tragedy of the commons. You know, what about common goods? And who's going to pay for that at the end of the day? You know, us as a society, unfortunately. So yeah.
And the stakes are quite high. And I would like to add something. We've been talking about the ethical issue with AI, but do you think that, let's say, most companies are getting involved in that, or it's like still in early process? I mean, from your expertise, from your experience, because I know you kind of working in that. So do you get like a lot of demand about it, or it's still in the early process?
Demand about what exactly? About AI ethics, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. Bringing ethics into AI.
I think that's there have been enough scandals in the past so that companies start worrying about their public image. So it's not really a question of we want to do good, but rather we cannot afford to not do good. So that's the first aspect. A little bit, if you make the similarity with ecological responsibilities about companies, now there is a lot of societal concern about not polluting the environment too much or not polluting it at all. And people tend to actually, well, make now decisions and also in that context. So I think that that's pressure towards ethical AI is also coming slowly but surely from society. And once those companies realize that, then they have a higher demand on, okay, we know that there is an issue, we'll have to tackle it. How do we deal with that? And it's just afterwards a question of getting the knowledge to be able to deal with those questions. The problem also is that in the field for a moment, and we just attended this afternoon, well, the translation of the frameworks and possible guidelines that there are right now into checklists, for example, just to make sure that when you're implementing a solution, you actually check about the different problems that could occur and you think about all the potential problems. One of the weaknesses of that is that, first of all, the translation can sometimes be a bit complex. And second aspect is that with any possible problem with from an ethical aspect, you can list what you've already seen up until now, but that's no warranty that it's not going to occur or in a different way in the future. So there, it's unfortunately a problem which is very, very difficult to solve, to make sure that what you've built up until now, you can only, well, basically do your duty of care about thinking about the potential issues, but you cannot be sure 100% guarantee that you're going to solve and to make sure that everything is all right in the future.
So you're basically saying some companies are getting involved into that for marketing purposes?
And also, sorry, just a quick comment. I think that if ethics was making money at the end of the day, we would have more cooperation moving towards it.
Yes. It's kind of true. It's not all the companies like that. Some of them have actual people that really are driven by that motivation, but it's not something which is for every company the case. So indeed, there is a demand for that. We can look at the bigger players for the well, usually such as a GAFA. They tend to respond to public pressure once there's a red line that has been crossed, and then they realize, okay, now we've gone too far, we need to roll back a bit.
Yes, maybe for example, we're doing a high-level impact study with the Federal Police of Belgium, and it's very interesting because you have impacts at many different layers. It's very philosophical, but also you can have a coding error that completely ruins your results and creates problems. You have problems when the algorithm performs well, but also when it performs bad, and so on. But what I really want to say is that it's well, you have consumer pressure. Huh? The young are much more value driven. So you have pressure on companies. And I feel this vibe, at least I'm quite optimistic on that plan. I think we're too late, but also on climate change. But I have the impression that corporations are becoming more responsible. But and I forgot my point, of course. No, there are often, yes, very difficult trade-offs. For example, in the police, you can say, you cannot use these technologies because it's dangerous. But you live in a context. Often you don't have the luxury to not investigate and not to start using these kind of technologies because criminals they could not provide their services anymore. You have also robustness of algorithms and for example, against adversarial attacks, it's a trade-off with privacy. You need data to make them more robust. So you have very difficult trade-offs if you start digging deeper, and that's what we should do. That's what you say too. It really depends on the case, and it's really a box of Pandora once you start. You get really paranoid, which, well, it's huge, to quote a very intelligent man.
Yeah, I actually agree with the Pandora box analogy. I actually like that. It's also feel, although this is actually a debate since, I don't know, from the past century as well, with the technology of the nuclear weapons, that when you start, you just can't stop because you want to be even more fortified than the other person. So I think it's kind of the same thing when you get this analogy to a race, who gets the best technology out there to be the first. But also perhaps what we should focus on also is like building the artificial moral agent as well, by implementing certain guidelines. And on the social issue, frankly, I have no answer because there are these disparities, like Alice mentioned, between difference of interest and the tragedy of the commons. That at just some point, it's up to certain people who care about this to start raising those concerns. But yeah, although this was the same debate, even with other disciplines, like even when statistics start in the early 20s, when it was being used in court cases to justify if someone will be, in Sally Clark case, for instance, in London, statistics were used to judge if the kids were dying out of SIDS, and it turned out some years later that the statistics used were wrong. But yeah, it's.
Maybe before moving to the audience and online, you've just talked about guidelines. If you had to, well, let's say you have a chart together, all of you, what would be your go-to guideline? An easy one, let's say. I know it's a hard question, but let's say we've talked about different topics right now, and maybe just one of yours, which will be your most important one.
You mean guidelines in the algorithmic bias detection, or general?
General.
For me, of uttermost importance would be diverse engineer groups and multidisciplinary teams, like with big thinkers, as you mentioned, philosophers from other social sciences. And I think this should be incorporated also in a new curriculum, that people will actually start getting this multidisciplinary training, because I think it will be also in demand in the next decade. with the increasing needs from the company side to the governmental side. And yeah, so I believe in that sense that diverse teams would also be able to raise those concerns, because if these things are not of your concern, they won't be raised. Somehow they need to be raised, and they will be raised only by people who are actually facing them. And also from the algorithmic perspective, I believe that it's very important to have some guidelines like fairness, accountability that you mentioned, and actually some of this stuff, besides being just mathematical gibberish, but at the end of the day, they have some by combining the human aspect, the human side, can have some interpretability of what these mathematical calculations mean. And I think there is actually some guidelines like fairness criteria, how to ensure not being subject to statistical bias, historical bias, selective bias. This means like having a representative sample, having a trained sample that actually it's not, doesn't have imbalances, or actually having not self-fulfilling prophecies inside something that just reproduces an imbalance endemic to the system as whole.
I think I would like to. Yeah, thank you. I think I would encourage people to think whenever they're designing like an AI or an algorithm, you know, what is my target? How is my data being captured? Is it diverse enough? So I would just encourage people to be curious and think about the bigger picture, actually. Like we shared, eventually, you know, if you build a design that's gonna be consequential, we're not talking about numbers anymore. The outliers within your data set might actually be minorities, and this might impact the life of citizens. So I think I would encourage people to think about the global picture. Martin, do you want to?
No, I completely agree. Well, with both points, I think definitely these were my top two as well. One that I'll say is that it's very hard. AI to do it well is really, really very hard. And that's the expectations are often completely wrong. People expect to learn about it in 2 hours, while no one expects to be a nuclear scientist in a course of 2 hours. So I think there is there's a perception problem too. And then also the fact that we live in a very technology-centric society. We always go for technological solutions. I think this is also part of the problem, but that's more what you said.
Okay, I'm not really sure I understood the question the same way the rest of the audience did. Because I was going to mention that since we're in Europe, it's mainly about the LTI for the moment. That's basically the work on which a lot of different stakeholders, think tanks and lawmakers, ethicists and so on, have actually come together to draft a document about, okay, those are the guidelines, those are all the problems that could occur for the moment that we've already identified and that we should be thinking about. And indeed, then going back to bringing for a specific use case the different stakeholders together, and that's assigning them that guideline, that framework, and then telling them, okay, now look at what you're going to do in this context. Is there, or try to detect issues before they actually occur. And that's to me the best approach that we have right now, that we have developed up until now. I hope that maybe it's going to evolve and going to be refined a bit so that it's more efficient. But for the moment, I think that it's still an open problem, an open subject for which we don't really have a good solution. And yet, and I don't expect it to be. I don't expect that we're going to have a good solution anytime in the future, because the problem is too wide to be answered by a simple solution.
Hopefully, it won't take that long. So yeah, let's move to the public. So, anyone want to ask something? Want to add question or add? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Here. Online? Okay.
Yeah. So Alessandro says, I believe there are proposals on insurance company taking the accountability for self-driving vehicles later risk. And do you know more about it? And what is actually your opinion on the subject? That about them taking responsibility for that, any accident occurring for self-driving cars? I don't usually one.
No, indeed. I can't really answer this question, but I think we have a lot of constructs already in society, so I can't really help you further. I'm sorry. But also like licensed jobs, so that not everyone can practice it. Governance. I strongly believe in innovative. I call it, it's just a nice term, innovative governance structures. And so I think that this is really the way forward, to have interdisciplinary boards looking beyond the silo, risk-based across the life cycle, and so on. But so I don't have more information, but I can look for it.
Yeah, to me, there are two aspects to that question that could be looked at. The first one is the problem of what happens if the car breakdowns and the AI doesn't work and then there is an accident. That's the first part of the question. I don't think that that question has been answered anyway for the moment. So I'd say that it's still the responsibility of the driver right now. In the future, we'll see how it goes. Maybe there will be a specific context in which then we'll say, okay, the car is actually responsible. And then it will be like when you're using specific products that are supposed to be behaving in a certain way. The second way to look at that question is rather, okay, when the car has to make a decision, for example, between killing the driver or killing a person on the road, for instance. And that's, I think, a societal question that we need to answer all together. And to which, if you want to have some fun, I think it was the MIT that set up a small tool online called moralmachine.net. And it's very fun because you have a lot of different scenarios where, depending on who you're going to kill, whether it's in the car or no, but okay, I say it's fun, it's not really fun, but it raises the question of which values do you use to be able to judge those situations, depending on whether they're going to be babies or elderly people, a pregnant woman, whether it's the car which is in fault or people crossing the red light, for instance, and all those different values, even if you don't want to actually answer the question, once you go through that exercise and you realize, okay, I have a set of values with which I'm going to evaluate the situation. And then the problem becomes, okay, what are going to be societal values? So our common values, and I'm pretty sure that if you just take the people here in the room, we all have different values for estimating that problem.
Yeah, I think as well. All right, we do have another question of someone wondering what you think about using AI to solve biases issues instead of creating more, because as this person says, like, ambiguity doesn't exist in computer languages. And so it is us, like human AI trainers, who are the cause of biases and not the technology. Does anyone want to answer that?
Yes, I can answer. I can try to answer. I feel that actually is what we mentioned previously about predicting something. Basically, you reinvent the wheel. You rediscover with your model the very same systemic biases that are historically present. So basically, how you tackle this is like by collaborating with what we mentioned previously, the diverse teams who can actually go one step further and say, okay, here is a historically marginalized group. So we recognize that, and together with the machines, we build a solution for the problem. But this is the first level that I can think of, because that's why we're here, to recognize that. And then from there we move and find solutions. And there are already there's lots of work happening in that respect, as we saw, with different from very different also universities or other companies that they're trying to tackle this issue and actually figure out what's happening and how we can build fairer systems. That's my take on that. Anyone wants to add something? Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, a few labs in the US are already relying on AI to create more diverse team. So like the audience said online, like, of course, as human, we're just gonna like transmit the bias to the algorithm. But I, as a person, I want my AI to be able to counterbalance the bias I have so that we can have a more objective approach. So definitely, yeah.
Okay, no more questions? Any questions here or want to? No? Yeah, sure. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, thanks. Hello, my name is Pietro, and I found interesting what you said, and yeah, apologies if I was a bit late, but you know, we got stuck. Apparently, yeah, we talk about AI, but you know, apparently there were bus problems, so you know, more or less. But one thing I was wondering was that you know, once I was working for a startup, and we had to make sure, no, we were working for we wanted to develop a machine learning solution as a part of a EU incubator program. So of course we wanted to make sure that our proposal was EU compliant. So already, you know, envisioning the recommendation for the regulation for AI, we wanted to make sure that our proposal was EU compliant. And of course, at the same time, for example, one of the issues you mentioned was that, but as we know, gender may be introduce bias. But it may also be informative for the model itself. So I remember that some colleagues then we come up with the idea, okay, we make sure we don't accept as input the gender, okay? But then I was wondering, also as a person that likes to follow a bit what the EU politics, and do you think, you know, that for example, avoiding certain input should be like a request from EU legislation, or should be more like you would expect more that company will follow this trend and they will try to they will at certain point they will stop using certain input because, as you said, the diverse team said that it's not in line with the diversity policy. Because I see it as a very relevant problem, no? Right? We may understand that there may be some features that are still informative, but at the same time are still discriminatory in terms of, and I don't know, I mean, I know it's an open question, but I'm quite curious to understand whether you can come up with a solution from a legislation perspective, or maybe it's gonna be like, I don't know if you have any thought about this. Maybe you already said, I apologize if you already.
So, yes, it's, well, probably it won't solve the problem because you can have other features correlated with gender and so on. But I think we should go for a dialogue because it's so context specific. It can maybe save lives, and like medication, make it gender specific. So I really think we should go for a dialogue with audits and so on, and experts assessing the solutions that are being made. Also in the real world, because you need this feedback, as you said, within the real world, because these biases creep in, and often you're not aware. Often it's others that point out that there was a bias or it's present and nobody sees it. So I think we should create this feedback loop through reality, and these governance boards. I think that's the way forward. Or, well, I have no clue, actually, to be honest.
Like bringing agile thinking.
Yes.
Yeah.
Also, I think from like a philosophical perspective as well, from the West, we are quite often, the way we're gonna think is about the duality. We're gonna oppose things, or we're just gonna go for like binary solutions. And as for gender, it's much more complex than just like duality or binary. So it's like, how do you embrace that complexity within your algorithm, knowing, as you said, when you started, like mathematics is meant to simplify the world. So how do you embed that complexity within your algorithm? And yeah, so like you said, I think it's like a case specific issue.
Want to say something?
Yeah, no, just I don't know if you removing the input can be a solution, or other you come for your business you come up with other solution. Like I don't know if you already mentioned about this. Like maybe I know a unit that assess, as you said, that you know this you can do, or like such as like if after all it's what they're doing with GDPR. No, that now you need to have a what is it, the data protection officer that after all need to assess the validity or not. Do you think this is something you're having in your organization, or?
There is no good answer to that question, actually. Depending on the use case you're going to have, gender or any other feature could be interesting or not. First of all, you need to ask yourself the question, do you want to be able to identify the bias? That's the first point. Second point, as Johan mentioned, it could be correlated to anything else. Third point is, what kind of fairness do you want? Do you want fairness because you can identify the different groups, or do you want actually that feature identifier to be put on the side so that two people, gender parts having exactly the same profile, get the same results? And there, I don't know if you've already heard about it, but it's basically the concept of group fairness versus individual fairness. And from a mathematical perspective, you cannot have both at the same time. As long as you have, as soon as you have two different groups, you either have the one or the other, but not both at the same time. So that's, to me, the first part. The second part is then, depending on the use case, sometimes you will want the gender to be taken out, but in other scenario, let's say medical sciences, it's actually a very good informative feature to deal with, because you can make a lot of educated decisions because, well, genetically speaking, men and women or any type of gender afterwards are not affected by the same type of diseases in the same scenarios. Men, for example, are much more have much higher risk, for example, for cardiovascular problems, for instance. So they're taking that into account. It's actually very important. And so any decisions and any questions that you will come up with regards to AI shouldn't be done generically for AI, but rather use case specific, because the AI is just a tool that you apply to any type of problem. So it's going to be problem related and not AI related. The solution shouldn't be applied for the tool, but rather for the problem itself.
Can I add something very quick? Yes, I agree with the distinction, but also, like, for instance, just to give an example, like, so when you take gender into account, you can ask the question, if I shift the genders, will I have the same proportions, for instance, in the pay gap? If you don't, and then perhaps you should reconsider, or it perhaps should make you, or even if you do that analysis inside your company, it should make you think, why not, and what's the difference if the input is the work hours, and for the same roles, why there is different outputs, if it's solely on the gender, and also, as you mentioned previously, on the hidden correlations, because you may not have included gender, but something that is related to that, correlated. So you need to also be aware of this incorporation, of incorporating such elements inside your model that incognito are amplifying your result. So, yeah.
Thank you. There it is.
Yeah, another topic, and maybe a concern from my side, is when it comes to AI, people don't necessarily, or users don't necessarily know that they are subject to AI. So if you compare to GDPR, then there's privacy and that protects you. But here, for AI, you don't necessarily know that you're being subject to the technology. So that's definitely a challenge, I think.
I think also about the GDPR, I think what also should change is that the terms and conditions, when we read the page, I think nobody reads that. When you give your, when you accept that and you say, okay, yes, I agree, I think this should change, because nobody will go into trouble to read that. Or I think it's like a bit of a hypocritic as well, because there is also not other choice of, perhaps there is in some cases, just use some element of customization, but I think that's definitely something that should change. And I think this is in the topic of technological ethics, but in the broader scope of AI ethics. But yeah, that's definitely something that should change, in my opinion. And you want some?
Yes, and I think it's indeed we should go for a society where we can trust each other in general. I think that's not a bad idea. But then what structures do we build so that you don't have to be careful online? And of course, this is against the logic of the web, but now it's converging again to a few big players. So I think that's more a solution instead of starting that you from distrust, that we make sure that we can trust through sector organizations and so on.
Thank you. Actually, it was another question. Yes. As you work at university, like within the data science class, for example, do you have like a philosophical class, or do you have like ethics class? Are these like discussed within the courses? I was just wondering.
Yeah, so at least what I do is I always talk of 3 levels of abstraction in AI. So you have the philosophical one, so the conceptual one, which is very important. For example, what categories do we choose? Because this is also often not discussed, even without bias, how you choose your categories, like personality are 5, or like you say, the gender is only 2. This has a huge impact on the thinking of humans. So because we are also adaptive machine, well, not machines, but adaptive. So we create our own feedback loops. But so I always talk about this conceptual level, then the mathematics, the formalization, and then the coding level. And you need to think at these 3 levels at the same time, which needs new kind of people. It's very hard to do. So I try, but you need to do it in a concrete case, because otherwise it's so abstract and fluffy. Yeah.
I want to add something to that. I think also that sometimes statistics expresses certain measures like tendencies, central tendencies, as we see, so that we create these Platonic categories in the sense of Western dualism that you mentioned previously, but the reality, sometimes we force reality into those categories and we pretend that these categories are real, but they're merely a representation of reality. So even in the gender case, if you go, so statistics is like the dictatorship of the majority. If you take the classes and the distinction, you say men and women, you see inside the women, you may find such diverse, even from the hormonal levels or other physical quantities that you take to women, and they are like the day with the night, perhaps much more in some cases than taking a man and a woman. So building those Platonic categories, I think we should really reconsider our reality and how we make and craft those categories that we're trying to fit things into. Perhaps sometimes it's more of a spectrum. Sometimes it's more, and we need to consider that, perhaps changing our viewpoint. So when we make a classification, perhaps we use a more broad scope. Perhaps 10 years ago, someone would say to you, you have to think outside the box. Perhaps today we have to think without the box at all.
I just want to add, there is a very nice article from Christopher Alexander from the 60s, an architect, on a city is not a tree, which is exactly about this. If you have these structures, you start to see reality, and that's the epistemological effect, that we change our thinking to fit the categories, and on the long term, it will make us more stupid, I think. To end on a depressive note. Sorry. Thank you.
So actually, to go back on the first question and the topic of tonight, like, do you trust AI? And actually, my question is going to be for Jérôme. What's your view on that one, if you wish to participate?
Well, I can. It's a complicated topic. To not go like in detail and be it short, let's say, it will be hard for me to say no, because I'm working with it, let's say, on a daily basis. Because if I say no, I don't trust it, it means I don't trust what I'm doing. But if I say yes, well, I kind of know how it is inside the box. So I kind of know how it works. And I know I cannot say yes. So it's For me, if I had to put my data science goggles, I would say yes, of course, I trust it. But as if I'm more like ethical and human, I don't trust it yet, or at least how it is right now in the world. And do you trust it?
Huh. Not as it is now, actually, not yet. Or actually, let's say I wouldn't trust AI that would be like consequential. Yeah, that would be, yeah, that was for me. Does anyone want to answer that question? Dive into the pool? Yeah.
Basically, the same answer as you have, depending on the impact that it can have on people. But I wouldn't really care about AI itself, but rather about the people that have built the solution. Those are the person really making the decisions and looking into the issues and trying to prevent any big problems from occurring. So I think that the question should rather be directed towards those people, and do they have, well, taken the precaution for the AI to be trustworthy or not? And to that extent, then getting all the tools in place for us to actually be able to build the trust is actually quite important. And that's, I hope, where we're going to move towards in the future.
Yeah, or you should use it with caution. But it's like automatic pilots, they can fly on automatic pilot, but if you don't train them on how to not do it, and we get reliant on it. That's a big danger, is if it works too well, 90% correct, you just start trusting it because the machine is right. So this is vigilance. We should train ourselves to stay critical. And then why not? Can bring beautiful things.
Thing is, human tend to be lazy, and when they have this already out of the box answer, they're like, yeah, I'm going with that. This machine, this thing is saying me yes, no, some numbers, yeah, I trust it. And then they tend to be lazy. So like we discussed about it where earlier, it's also the end user which needs to trust it, but not so much, and needs to be challenging always what is the output. But yeah, I'm the host.
Yeah, I think it's actually, sorry, it's going to be quite short, but it's your responsibility as a citizen. I think not towards only AI, but what you're going to encounter like on a daily basis. You should be critical, you should be curious and ask questions, seek answers, Yeah, that would be my 5 cents.
Oh, I was actually going to say exactly the same stuff. The problem is not AI related, it's people related. People are lazy by definition. So it's not really that they rely on the AI because it's AI, it's just that they don't want to make the efforts to do something else.
Okay, we opened another box, but no, but it's not that I agree, but for example, it will take courage to stand up against the algorithm if it's always correct. Imagine you're in a group and you say, no, I don't follow the algorithm. It's much easier to hide behind the algorithm if it's 90% correct, and then, oh yes, I was. So, and it's not that easy to do, I agree, but in practice, there will be a lot of peer pressure. What to do then, how to handle, you need governance, exception handling, it will cost money, and so on. So in practice, it's not that straightforward.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so also want to add about the trust issue. I think I'm on the similar as Alice. And I also believe that sometimes when we're trying to extend our prediction and stuff, I think there's an audacity inherent in human nature that we know everything, but the model can entail as far as the human knowledge can go, not beyond that, because there are many levels of epistemic knowledge. There is also the concept of unknowns, and that model cannot predict, even if we don't know. It's just a reflection of our own limitation. It can go beyond where human can go. I mean, it can't explore better than us due to memory, CPUs, and all that, but there are boundaries. It's beyond that, no one can dwell. Perhaps imagination, that's the only limit. So that's why I said at first, passion. Yeah, that's why I said at first that for me, I'm a huge proponent of like hybrid intelligence, human and machine, combining imagination, strengths and weaknesses, advancing not just one over the other, both converging together. That's my take. So that would I trust more.
Yes. What do you think about this move to make AI easy to use, like Azure, for example, advertises it as AI at your fingertips. So you just drag and drop some plugin concepts on data and that's it. But usually the user are not technically like knowledgeable or anything. They don't have the mathematical or analytic insights on what it does and what it's going to do with the outcome. So, and obviously it has led to some very poor business decisions. So what's your take on that?
I think it's a recipe for disaster. Yeah. I use some, but it's a danger because it's of course because there are many reasons of this new wave of AI, and it's not that purely, I think, that the technology, it's open source, that you have good libraries, bigger building blocks, you have the cloud, so you can compete with the bigger ones and so on. So these are really drivers, and so of course they help innovation. But if you don't know what you're doing, it's absurd. It's really absurd. But it's a problem because I see many, especially if you purely approach AI from a technical perspective, it always gives an answer and it's fun. Haha, fun, yeah, great. But yeah, it's very dangerous.
Nothing else? Yeah. Anyone in the audience want to say something? No? Okay. Maybe if you have any final word about that topic.
I think I'm just going to repeat what I said before. It's just think about the bigger picture. I would just encourage people to think and just reflect, actually. And yeah, maybe like on a hopeful notes, like I think discussions like the one that we're having now and that have been, taken, maybe it's gonna, inspire as well young generation or academic to just transform the curriculum to adapt to the question that we raised now. So I think that's a hopeful sign for the future as well.
I'd continue on that, basically the same idea and just raising awareness. The more people are educated in the subject, the better they're going to be able to react to potential problems, issues, and to know what to expect from that.
Okay. I have to. I guess also for me, another important thing is that we should, besides talking about something, we should also being proactive and receiving, actually acting on that. So being, keeping a critical eye on all these innovative technologies, always thinking, as you mentioned previously, the bigger picture and without the box, basically, not even out. And always perhaps having a critical mind to challenge the status quo, especially when the status quo, there is a recognition that it's broken, challenge it even more. Yes, so that's my take.
Yes, I don't know. I think indeed it's often there is a profit drive, and we should take a wider perspective and also move away a bit from this technological and success. We really have a highly success culture, like show success on social media and so on. I think this is also a driver for some of the problems because you need to admit that things are sometimes shit, or and because then you learn and you can share it.
All right. right. So thank you to the panel. Thank you to the audience online and here on site. I hope the discussion was interesting and it raised awareness through your, I don't know, your background, but your different backgrounds. And yeah, so thank you and goodbye. There it is.